Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to our presentation today. We're just going to take just a minute or two and see if there's a couple other stragglers that are coming in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, we have a lot to talk about today, so let's go ahead and get started with our presentation. Thank you all for coming today. This is a roundtable discussion to complement the latest issue of the Talking Stick magazine, looking at the benefits of trauma-informed approaches. My name is James Bauman. I'm the Director of Publications for ACUOI and the editor of the Talking Stick. And I have said, for as long as I've had this job, which has been many years now, I do not come from a housing background, and everything that I have learned about campus housing and student affairs, I have learned from reading and editing the Talking Stick. And I have learned an awful lot over the years. And I want to say that with this last article, or on this topic, the last couple of articles that we've run here, I found to be incredibly educational. And it's something that is applicable into the world of campus housing and student affairs, but I think it's applicable no matter what profession you're in. So I'm very excited to have our presenters today. Just to give you a quick housekeeping, this session is being recorded so that you can share it with others after the fact or go back and review some things if there's anything that you missed. Please feel free to use the chat bar as we go through to for side conversations, or if you have a question for down the road. This is a conversation-based presentation. Our speakers will get things started, but as this goes on, we want it to be interactive. We want to hear from you in the audience. We want to answer your questions to keep those things going. We will say when if you do chime in, please state your name and your institution and ask your question. And I would also take a quick moment to mention that as ACUOI has been navigating the pandemic along with everybody else, we've really been working to introduce and enhance our online resources, whether that be the online community, our website, or our ever-growing YouTube page with the recordings of presentations such as this. So, as I mentioned, this the November issue of the Talking Stick, the cover of which is here, I had heard of the topic of trauma-informed approaches. I had seen it mentioned, and it grabbed my attention. Found a handful of our volunteers that were informed in this area, knowledgeable about it, and they contributed to the conversation story discussing this topic in that. As a coincidence, at the same time in this issue, we had an article about infusing social justice practices into your staff training. And in the course of that article, the topic of trauma-informed approaches was brought up as well. So if anybody asks, I will say it was carefully pieces of strategy on my end to bring this all together, but the truth of the matter was it was a happy accident. But again, I think that is also evidence of the fact that this is such an important topic that is quickly gaining ground within the campus housing world and worthy of our conversation. So here are our panelists for today. I'm going to shut up now and I'm going to turn it over to them to do a quick introduction. Anybody feel free to jump in.
I'll go first. Hello, everyone. I see some familiar names and faces out in the crowd. I'm going to make this as interactive, I guess, as possible. Tiffany Bromfield. I currently serve as the Associate Director for Residence Life and Inclusion at Buffalo State College, and I use she, her, cis pronouns.
I can go. My name is M. Doolittle. I use they and them pronouns, and I am the Basic Needs Advocate, housed both in Student Housing and Dining Services and the Basic Needs Center at the University of California, Davis.
I can jump in. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Noah. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm an area coordinator at the University of Cincinnati.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Kinner, and I currently serve as the Associate Vice President for Student Affairs and Director of Housing and Residence Life at Ball State University, and I use she, her, hers pronouns.
And I'll go last. My name is Leona Wilson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am Assistant Director of Residential Education at the University of California, Davis. Welcome, y'all.
Fantastic. Again, so thankful to have you all here and glad to have a nice large crowd for today. So let's get things started with just a simple foundational question. How do you define trauma-informed practices? And why don't we go ahead and start with M?
Oh, now there's a few things that I want to highlight. There's 5 principles of trauma-informed practices. I could not state them off the top of my head, but the ones that are most relevant to the work that I do is maximizing choice. I work with students experiencing basic needs crises, so financial crises typically. And that can feel very much like you have no options. And so maximizing choice is huge for me. Only asking for the information that I need to support the student, because I think if we ask for more than that, it's less about the support and more about curiosity, and that is not always helpful when there's trauma in a space. And I think finally, accountability is a big piece of trauma-informed practice, of recognizing what we can do and what we can't, and telling students that, because I can't wave a magic wand as much as I want to. And so I think trauma-informed is recognizing here is what can happen in this space and not raising expectations more than they necessarily should be. There are many other elements to trauma-informed practice, but that is my personal definition of my work.
Amanda, what would you add as your sort of personal definition?
Yeah, I guess when I think of trauma-informed approach, I think of really looking at each individual as a whole person. What's standing before you in an office is a small part of who they are and the background and the experience and the feelings that they bring into that space with them. And sometimes we come and we make assumptions in our interactions with individuals that are far off from their lived experience. And so for me, a trauma-informed approach is letting go of those assumptions. It's extending grace. It's listening beyond what they're saying to what they're thinking, what they're feeling, how they're interacting, and just knowing that oftentimes there's more going on than what's showing up in front of us in our spaces. And so making sure I'm asking questions, listening, and paying attention to those approaches is really important.
Tiffany, what would you add to that mix?
I would say the biggest thing for me is the standard of care. I do agree with the previous folks who have spoken, but I think, and one of the things that I deal with a lot, particularly with residential students, and I always bring this up, is although like our university police typically are the student or the office we have to respond to crises, I don't think we realize how much the police presence escalates a crisis before we have the opportunity to actually deal with the task at hand. So I always, particularly when talking about trauma-informed care, it is the level of care that we have when dealing with not just the student who's involved, but any like bystanders. So the roommate, the residents on the wing, the residents in the building, like how are we continuing to be supportive across all the board in supporting all the students and not just necessarily the student who's directly impacted.
Leona, your thoughts?
I don't have too much to add, but what sticks out for me when I think of the question, which is around a trauma-informed practice, I really think about actively trying to reduce harm, whether that be creating some type of environment that is safer for folks. There's a big component of trust that goes into having trauma-informed approaches. So thinking about how we're communicating with transparency, providing context when it's helpful, and obviously relationship building when possible can help build trust. And then kind of similar to Tiffany, thinking about compassion and empathy and the role that that plays in demonstrating care through our actions is important as well.
And finally, Katie.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that's kind of been stated. I think for me, one of the biggest things is when you're looking at creating policy or implementation of some sort of new procedure, looking at it from a lens of just assuming that your audience is going to have some level of trauma, and you don't necessarily need to know what that is or know all the details of it to be able to support them through it and make a more inclusive practice moving forward. So I think that really plays on who they are as a holistic person and those elements of care that have been talked about.
That's great. I appreciate hearing all those different thoughts. And I left a note in the chat. I'd be interested for our participants or our attendees, you know, how do you define trauma-informed approaches, either what you know as your experience, or maybe what your preconceived notion of it was as you were coming into this presentation. Please feel free to go ahead and leave those in the chat. So my next question, and this was one of the things that I found really fascinating about this subject as I read your comments in the past, was that trauma-informed approaches seems to be a mixture of sort of concrete things that can be documented as part of your policies and processes, but then there's also something that's maybe a little bit more intangible, a state of mind, a mindset that goes into that. So as you work to integrate trauma-informed approaches on your campus, how do you sort of navigate that sort of mixture between concrete and a little bit more amorphous, and how does training come into play and all of that? Again, I'll just sort of open it up to the group, see if anybody wants to respond to that.
So the first part for me is training, right? Because I think, and we've had this conversation and trying to find other ways, like behind closed doors can be a traumatic experience for a lot of first-time RAs, particularly when in true, residence-like fashion, we use the veteran RAs to be the actors who, actually experience some of those things. So they go like way into it. Like this year we had somebody like fake try to jump out of a window for like a suicide idea. Yeah, it was insane. But I do think how we go about addressing some of those activities are very necessary, but also how do we train our professional staff to support our student staff when they've actually encountered and responded to some of those incidents. I do look at training as the opportunity to teach and engage in conversations, particularly around what a standard of care looks like. Because I think somebody's earlier point, I think it might have been Katie, who stated like, we just assume that folks have trauma when they get to our campuses, right? Like we've all experienced the COVID-19 pandemic. Everyone who's coming to our college campus, student, parent, faculty, otherwise, has had some experience with this. So how do we address the feelings of isolation, loneliness, the lack of communication skills with some of our residents because they haven't talked to anyone in a year and a half or 2 years outside of a computer screen, right? So it is sometimes about trying to anticipate the need of what our students are going to need, what our staff's going to need. How do we support faculty, and other offices? Because also the collaborative nature is still there for our areas, but this office may not be comfortable doing things in person, while like residents life, we don't have a choice. So how do we continue to build those bridges and maintain those relationships are also important, and something that I've seen particularly with training starting to be a little bit more challenging because folks are like, I'm not going to a room with 150 student staff to present on whatever, like, no. So how do we kind of build that bridge and still continue to meet the needs of our student staff and our professional staff and residential students, given just where we are as a society?
Tiffany, I like what you said. When I was thinking about this, the culture of housing and residence life has for years have been that crisis has been just a rite of passage. It's just something we do, and we're strong and we take care of our students through that crisis, not necessarily paying attention to the fact that that trauma builds up with our team, with our student staff, with our professional staff, and we oftentimes sacrifice our own well-being and our team's well-being in the effort of caring for our students. And so when I think about this in training, I guess one of the things I've been thinking about is many of our first responders, when they deal with a serious trauma incident in their jobs, there's mandated debriefing, there's mandated counseling, there's opportunities to process through it. And yet, how often do we send our student staff and our professional living staff into very difficult trauma situations and then expect them to show up the next day in the office and do a one-on-one or manage a program or do an occupancy report? So when we think about training, I think part of what we need to talk about is normalizing the trauma's impact and our work with students and how it's impacting our ability to do our jobs. And then how do we help folks learn how to work through that trauma in a healing manner and provide space for people to not be okay when they walk back into work the next day, and to have space for them to process through that and talk through that and support the healing of our team as well as our students that are involved in the trauma.
Yeah, going off of that, Amanda, I think one of the other things I think about is when trying to like implement it, right, is thinking through that that person might not be in the place to advocate for themselves after that situation. And so I think we fall into the trap a lot of times as housing officers of people who are naturally caring, right? You want to say, I'm here for you, let me know if you need anything. But when I'm processing and I'm in that moment of I just went through XYZ situation, I might not know what I need or be able to articulate it in a polished way or whatever in that moment. So I think of longer than like I 100% agree with it starts in training, absolutely. And then longstanding with that, how are you implementing those policies to be longstanding practices? So not if, but when a student crisis happens, the people who responded to that, what are the next things that are happening that very next day? Who's the person sending those emails of where they can find those resources on their campus? Who's the person touching base with them? Who's the person saying, hey, I don't want to see you in the office before noon, or whatever is, feasible at your own institution. I think taking it one step further and literally putting those things into the writing of the policy makes it a more of a normalized process instead of expecting the person who just went through it to advocate for those needs.
Anything else anybody has to add to that? I'm really glad that you brought that up. That was one of my questions to talk about that idea of, I think when the term trauma-informed approaches is discussed, the thought is immediately to go to students, but not taking into account what is needed to assist staff as well. And that is certain over the last couple of years with the different roundtables and things that we've been doing as an association. We've heard that time and time again, and particularly among the live-in staff, those that, not to be overly dramatic about it, but that are really on the front line during the pandemic and everything that's gone along with it. So I'm really glad to hear those comments. So we've talked about this in the concept and what it means and sort of these general approaches, but I would like our panelists to go through and share at least one sort of real concrete example of something that is an example of how these trauma-informed approaches are implemented on your campus. Maybe if it's something that has, especially if it's brand new in the last year or two, that's been brought into play, but just so people can get some real takeaways about what this looks like in practice.
I've got one. Before I get into the example, I think it's helpful to keep in mind, what do we even qualify as trauma? Because what's traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another. And when we think of trauma, what are we thinking of? Basic needs, for example. So having housing, food, other basic needs met was not defined as something that students were really struggling with until there were multiple reports in the UCs. We didn't have a center until 2000, about 4 years ago. And so what does it look like to be managing those traumas if they are not recognized by the institution? If there's not case management, my role was added 2 years ago. And so thinking through, as we've had the opportunity to develop this position and the case management specifically for basic needs, what does it mean to infuse trauma-informed practices at every level? So from the policy side of it, that has looked like we have emergency grants and we have standards and procedures for that. We have expectations about what types of questions, demographic, experience questions, and who asks them. We have an intake officer. The intake officer will not ask any specific questions beyond, would you like to meet with a case manager? Because we don't want them having to tell the story 14 times before we offer any form of aid. And then there's also the interpersonal pieces of doing basic needs and trauma-informed work. So when I meet with a student, I'm like, you do not need to use your experiences as a bargaining chip to explain to me why I should care or why I should offer you resources. What I want you to tell me is, what do you think I need to know in order to help you? And I can ask thoughtful follow-up questions using my professional experience. So both having it written into policy in terms of, we don't require a student to explain their trauma to apply for a basic needs emergency grant. If you have the need and you can document it, you get the money. And the interpersonal piece of it of, why am I asking you questions? How am I assisting you? And what do I expect you to bring to the table? I loved, there was a comment in the chat earlier about professors maybe don't know what a student has gone through previously, and we see that all the time. in basic needs and being willing and able to explain to campus partners and constituents of, hey, there's a concern going on here. I'm not going to tell you the specifics of it, but please be kind. So, and I think that's a key element of trauma-informed.
So my current campus doesn't have this, but my previous campus, the University of North Texas, shout out to Julie, she's in here, we work together. They had counselors in residence. So there were 2 counselors who were assigned to all residential students. So anytime a residential student was in crisis, they contacted the counselor in residence, and that helped. I do think, though, specific to the question, some of those more tangible, I guess, pieces of trauma-informed care when we talk about on our campuses, it's really just about staff recognizing the capacity to where and what they can help with. Because I oftentimes find that there's a lot of staff who are like, oh, I'm willing to help, but then when they encounter the student, they're not necessarily sure about language to use. I see this a lot sometimes with my students who are trans, like folks that misgender. There's a lot of other kinds of pieces that in the process can have the student endure more trauma as we're like trying to fix things. So really with the training pieces, it's about everyone being as knowledgeable as they can, or being able to say, well, hey, I'm not able to help you with this specifically, so let me get you to the person who can. And I think in housing and residence, like, we do a good job of training folks around, like, we can walk you to the counseling center, or we can, take you to the dean of students office. But those conversations before we get to the walking part are the things that I try to focus on with my staff, because I don't want to find that my staff has not aggressively, but has harmed somebody unintentionally because of use of language, or because of use of, handling the situation, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think when your university has resources, you can have a lot of things. When your university doesn't have resources, it's about how do we develop trainings to be able to support the staff that we do have so that they're competent. I said in a meeting today, I was like, my complex directors are not crisis support specialists. Like, that's not what they do. And we have to figure out a system that gets us with the counseling center and, other community resources to help us as students, because we can't afford to tap out our staff on something they're not necessarily capable to handle.
Jump in.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thanks. One thing we actually just started doing relatively recently is we implemented, we're calling them care cards. Still room for the name, but it's basically just a little card, looks like a postcard. And after any situation in which a student has had any sort of challenging circumstance, so that can be anything from they called the RA on call just to get some additional resources, to an ideation, or whatever the situation may be, anyone who is involved in that situation is going to get one of those cards. So I think a lot of times we also think of the person of concern as the only person that we're giving follow-up to, and then the respondent as the only other person we're checking on from like the staff side. We kind of sometimes forget about where their witnesses, were their roommates, was there a desk assistant maybe who was involved and made that first phone call. Any of those kinds of things also play into that. And we don't know what that is going to bring up for that person, right? So that care card on it has a whole list of our campus resources on it, so that student or individual can reach out to those groups. There's still some room to grow with that, because it still leaves the onus of the student having to be the one to reach out to those resources. But the one thing I love, that it's a tangible thing, right? Physically handing them something they can take away with them in that moment. I also love that it brings identity into play. I think sometimes what I struggle with is if I'm the one on call, then I'm the one you're stuck with for whatever that situation may be, versus if we're able to offer all those other resources from different offices, you can then also connect to someone who maybe looks like you, speaks the same language as you, worships the same way as you, whatever that may be. And that might be a better way to support that student, given whatever the situation may be.
One thing that comes to mind for me at a different university that I'm currently at is we required, it was a university directive, which typically was a good thing, for all of our students and staff to go through a racial justice training about 3 or 4 years ago. The context, though, of the student population, it being a very predominantly white, almost all predominantly white institution, Catholic folks from high income backgrounds, and having a pretty small minoritized population in terms of race and ethnicity made it a little bit more complicated. And so one simple thing that a lot of institutions, I'm sure, do is to create different affinity spaces, or at least opportunities to break out and talk to people that could potentially share an identity with you and have some overlap in experiences. So I mentioned that because I think it's important to acknowledge that some types of trauma are disproportionately experienced by certain groups because of like deeply entrenched structural inequities. And it's important to acknowledge that and kind of design for it when possible. So in this case, we were able to create different spaces for folks who could self-identify, for example, as a Black person, in my case, and then have some thoughtful questions that we are also thinking about as a planning committee for the training. So like, what are the needs of each of the groups? Does this training about racial justice, is it going to add clear value to like folks of color, or are we potentially going to do more harm than good? And if we know that there could potentially be some harm done, how do we actively try to reduce that or plan for it? Do they need to be present for this training? Is there a different space that we could create that allows them to share their experiences more freely and authentically, and find community and healing and support? Or do all students and staff need to be in the same space regardless of what their lived experience and identities are? So those are a few things that we thought about. And while it wasn't perfect, I think when done well, and at least when there's thought put into how to design trainings, that can be a great place to start in reducing harm.
I'll hop in here. I know we've talked a lot about programmatic initiatives that can happen. And I think sometimes as a live-in professional who is brand new to this field, I thought, I can't do that. I don't have the power to create a new job. I don't have the power to create affinity groups for my department. What can I do? And so as I was thinking about what can I do in my own personal practice? And I think, you know, some of those basic things is as you're doing your one-on-ones with your staff, how often do we say, how are you doing? And then we don't really listen to how they're doing. And so I think part of it is that authentic listening, engaging in relationships, really checking in with that person and how they are and asking, how can I best support you? And not putting our expectations on how people should show up in our spaces on them. And by that, I mean, how often when a situation happens on the news, I'd be like, oh, I expect you to come in and do your job. That who knows what might have happened yesterday might have triggered or impacted how they're going about their day. And so rather than expecting folks to show up, giving them space to say, I need to take a moment, I need to take a break, and not drilling them. Why do you need time off? Why do you need to step away? I need you to do this. Just allowing them to do what they need to do to take care of themselves and supporting them in that. And then I think for me, the other piece is being vulnerable and being willing to say, I'm not okay right now, and this is how I'm handling it. Because sometimes in our field, I feel like we have to we've got to do what we need to do, and we've got to take care of everybody else. And sometimes what they need to see is that we struggle with this too. We don't always have it all together. We don't always have a perfect experience, and we're working through that, and it's okay to work through it. We don't have to be on point all the time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's take a second and open it up to the audience. Is there anybody that would like to share a program, a project, something specific that they've implemented on their campus, again, maybe over the last couple of years, that's a good example of trauma-informed approaches being put into practice? If you have something, feel free just to chime on in. Okay. And this is why I keep other questions in my back pocket, so I can chime in. We've been talking about these new programs, and again, I think that the trauma-informed approaches, if not in reality, at least the perception is that this is a relatively new aspect of being brought into campus housing and student affairs. I'd be curious to hear from our panelists about if there is any such thing as a silver lining to a pandemic, is it the idea that everybody going through this collective experience might make campuses more receptive to this sort of approach to our work? Again, anybody, please feel free to chime in.
So that's kind of been my running tagline since I've got here. I just started at Buffalo State College in July. Like anytime something comes up, I'm like, y'all, it's the middle of a panini. We got the opportunity to try something different. So I'm like always like pitching ideas and throwing things out. I think specifically with the trauma-informed practices, because we do have in Buffalo, the University of Buffalo has like a trauma-informed practice center. So we've done a lot of conversations with them and brought them in to kind of facilitate some trainings to our staff so they have a better understanding of what a trauma-informed approach is. But I do think one of the things that I've instituted mostly through like RA training and like with our professional staff training is a lot more role playing of like, if a student comes to you and says, insert this, you know, thing here, how do we handle it? Another thing that I've tried to like really work on, and I don't want to say stressing, but really engaging in conversations around housing insecurity and like how that, just that idea for a lot of students is a reality, because some of them, this, like for most of the time, this living on campus has been some of the most stable housing that they've had through the duration of their lives. And I don't necessarily think folks consider that thought, like even in like our conduct processes and like charging students for things like, you know, violating the fire code and things like that. Like, yes, those are necessary measures and accountability. But for some of our students, they take those charges and feel like they're about to be put out, right? Like they think they're not going to have a place to live. So how do we engage in conversations around that? How do we make sure our policy is reflective of that? But it's a lot more, I think, for the trauma-informed piece is really working on the role play of like how you respond to things. But I also encourage my students and staff to ask more probing questions without being, I don't want to use the term aggressive, but like we do QPR, right? And QPR is very much like, do you have a plan to kill yourself? Like, yes, but trauma-informed care is not that. So how do, you know, we teach the staff to kind of take a softer approach when dealing with things that are related to trauma? So it's been interesting as I'm working on January training now, which sounds wild because I feel like the semester just started. But how do we try to put some of that, put some of those things into like our day-to-day one-on-ones and conversation with staff and stuff like that?
I think I would add that the pandemic has blurred the line between personal and professional lives quite a bit in terms of our workspaces. Now, live on staff, they were always living where they work. But, you know, I think for many of our administrative staff folks, and I think that has given a really useful opportunity to really be aware, ask probing questions about what's going on at home that might impact how you show up at work, and whether that's you know, the murder of George Floyd and all the organizing that was happening and continues to happen, or it's those basic needs concerns that Tiffany brought up in terms of, I think the pandemic brought to light what was always happening, but is now something we have to account for because your workspace is now your home space. And so I think we've had the opportunity to engage with that. Now, I think different institutions have done it differently. I know for us in basic needs, it's been the opportunity to say, you know, students have always been supporting their families with their financial aid money. That's always been happening. But now we can say, look at that difference it makes because they have stable housing, because they can contribute to their parents' rent or mortgage payment. And that means that they still have lights on and they have food on the table. And I think being willing to engage with, we are not two separate entities. We are not the person I am on campus and the person I am at home, but we are both and one all at the same time, always. And I think that's a key element of seeing someone holistically as a person rather than a number. And I think the pandemic forced us to think that way. And that could be somewhat of a silver lining.
Anybody else with some thoughts? Katie?
Sure. I would add that maybe one thing that I would consider a silver lining is the ability to think through it differently. So I think one thing that we have proven is we're going on 2 years of this. So we have more than proven that we're able to be innovative and do the things we've done before, but in a different way. And so I think it was Tiffany earlier mentioned BCGs, and that came to mind in terms of this. So during the pandemic and everything, were we necessarily going to have, 100 plus paraprofessional staff doing BCDs? Probably not. But did we also figure out ways to make sure that training happened and was still successful? Yes. And I would argue in some ways it became more inclusive and probably a little more accessible to some, because I think part of what can make BCDs super triggering and really difficult for some people is that there are so many people and so many people watching you. And there is, when there's all those returners who've lived the situation and they're all watching each other, they kind of up the ante to, put their best acting skills on. So when it's maybe smaller groups and there's not so much of that happening, I think it's truly gets back a little bit more to the actual training than it does to the show of BCDs sometimes. So that just made me think of BCDs as an example of one way that I think we don't necessarily have to all go back to how things were in every single situation. Maybe some things we've innovated for the better and they can stay this way.
Anyone else? Leota.
Yeah, I'll share. Em already alluded to like all of the attention that has now been placed on violence against Black and Brown people, typically by police folks, which has always been happening, but now it seems that white folks are more invested in learning more and exploring what that looks like and what their level of responsibility looks like. So I mentioned that because on our campus, and I'm sure across many campuses in our nation, a lot of folks are still having conversations and task forces, and hopefully that will result in actionable change about thinking about protocol, for example, in residence life and what that looks like. So specifically, where do we actually need police and first responders to immediately respond? Versus where might we be able to have a counselor or some other staff person to respond. So redetermining or redefining really what an emergency looks like and what situations require a police presence. And then where we might reinvest our resources or reevaluate our priorities and how we're serving our students, in particular, our students of color.
That's very interesting here, and again, it matches up with some conversations that we've heard elsewhere within the association about taking a look at what policing on campus looks like and what it looks like now and what it maybe should look like. Another question for the group. A lot of what we've discussed has seemed to be, for lack of a better word, reactive, something that goes into effect after a student has come forward and reported an issue or something that they're facing. I'm wondering if the next step of this is when people begin to go back and reevaluate processes, whether it's the application process, roommate assignments, occupancy, and all those things. If the trauma-informed approach could begin to be applied, I get, for lack of a better word, proactively in that regard, and some of these things in advance. I wonder if any of you have any thoughts on that process, or again, maybe if there's any actual examples of maybe where you, as a thought leader in this area, perhaps on your campus, could maybe begin, take this to the senior housing officers, to those people that are running more of the business operations side of things, et cetera, to try and implement this into the work.
Like an example. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tiffany.
No, you could go ahead because I talk too much.
I think an example for us is we are currently in the process of creating a more robust system for gender inclusive housing. And part of that conversation has been, how do we prevent it from being a one-off accommodation and more be trauma informed, and that what does it look like for someone to have a non-inclusive roommate, have that experience, have to come to us, get a room change, all of those pieces to try and be proactive about it. And part of the conversation, which was fascinating, was, well, who do we prioritize first? People with financial needs, and so basic needs concerns, or gender inclusive housing needs? And I think that's where the trauma piece came in of, it really doesn't matter if you can pay for it if you're unsafe in a living situation. And recognizing where priorities and values need to be is also a form of trauma-informed care. And in communicating with different elements of the res life business operations side of recognizing where, being more concrete, because I think trauma-informed can be very philosophical and heady, but saying like, what does this look like in a business practice? And what does it look like to say, if I have to choose between financial ability to pay and safe housing and gender inclusive, what do I pick and why? And how do I make that case to my leadership team? And being able to talk through the concrete policy side of it is also trauma-informed care in a proactive way. And so we ended up making a priority list, and top of that list is gender inclusive housing. And then it goes financial need. And so thinking about what are the different factors in my institution and my department that might influence and who are the key stakeholders, that's all trauma informed, but I don't think we frame it that way in a proactive kind of sense.
So I was basically going to say what Em said, but also our residence halls, for the most part, have public restrooms, and we still label our restrooms by gender, and that's not always the most inclusive idea. I do believe that even in our housing applications, sometimes when we talk about business operations and how we go about gendering folks for room placement is also could use some work at a lot of institutions, but then we also have some institutions, like I formerly worked in Texas, where there was literally like, there's a bill, we can't do anything as much as we tried to do things, right? So I do think too, really engaging in some of the policy conversations, but also at our respective institutions, not being afraid to pull in a complex director or someone else who may not be a member of the leadership team into the conversation. Because I do think now that I'm on a leadership team, and I use that in loose quotations, because there's areas of power and privilege and all that other kind of stuff. Like I could rant about this all day. But there are times where everyone on the leadership team generally will have the same idea because it's a lack of representation in some places. So being mindful about who's actually at the table essentially and who is engaging in the conversation. And I don't mean that as like this diversity like thought where people are like, oh, we just bring diverse people to the table. Like, no, you might need a consultant. You might need someone from outside the institution to say, hey, we're trying to do this. Let's get somebody who is credible and knows what they're talking about to try to make those essential changes. Because I do think now that we are, you know, still in the middle of this pandemic, we are selling a very different product to our residents and families, and we need to figure out how to meet the needs that they have, or we are as institutions just not going to sustain for a good amount of time.
Anyone else? Any other examples?
I think we mentioned it earlier, but you know, with the pandemic, it does give us this opportunity to create everything new, to examine what we've always done and see what needs to be adjusted and how we think outside of the box. And so for me, and I'm brand new at my campus too, we're looking at our policies and our procedures. What barriers might we be unintentionally creating for our students? What are some ways in which we might be causing harm with our language, with our process, with the documentation that's required? How do we make processes as simple as possible for our students so that they're not having to jump through hoops to get the support, to get the resources, to get the access that they need? We put a lot of things in place because it makes our work easier, and maybe we need to put that aside. It's not about making our work easier. It's about providing resources and services for students in a way that's not intrusive, that's not harmful, and how do we adjust our policies accordingly?
I feel like I've heard over the years, you know, conversations about everything from application deadlines to the fees that are required, and those small pieces that just seem totally ingrained in our work, but could have a dramatic impact on when a person applies for housing, and then what that means, what housing is going to be available for that student, particularly as campuses are managing their occupancy and those other factors. So yeah, I think that's very interesting to go back and take a look at what that means and what the impact is downstream. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to again open it up to the audience to see if anybody has any questions. And this time I'm going to be very patient, and I'm not going to take anybody off the hook, and I'm going to wait for someone in the audience to ask a question. And I have a record of who everybody is, so I can go back after the fact. So please, someone, one of our audience members, please, you know, chime in with a thought, a question for our panelists, let us know what this looks like on your campus. Just unmute yourself and jump right in.
Hi, my name is Leslie. I'm at Colorado Mountain College in Studio, and I'm somewhat of a life most work in strategy and conferencing. But I help assist with our training, and one of the topics that we come up with is the type of activity we're doing to direct common trainings for how to make that trauma inclusive, because I'm an LGBTQ person, and the common trainings exercises that it's used as the exercise called coming out. For those who are not familiar, it's in the shoes of someone who's going through the coming out process and ends with references to suicide and self-harm. So it's a very potentially traumatic exercise that I've gone back and forth on using, because there's my curriculum like, hey, this is traumatizing. This is bringing up things that we tend to re-experience. But then there's also, and this is where it gets into like that tricky for those who are and really be putting them in the shoes. So how are we balancing that level of informing the people who are not in that space, while also protecting the people who are in that space? So I really cushioned all those exercises in the, a lot about how are we, if you need to step out of the room, if you need to talk about it differently, and doing things like that. But then anytime you do exercise and activity and really one get go, is this helping, it's harming, and trying to find that balance. So I'm curious for panelists, how do you balance those activities you feel are beneficial for certain populations, while also could potentially create harm for people going through that?
Lexington, I think you were a little bit, your vocals were a little bit choppy on that one, at least on my end, but I think you were discussing with suicide ideation and training and the potential of that, the trauma that could have for the student staff and professional staff, and giving them the flexibility to step out of the room, et cetera, if needed. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, so trying to find that balance between programs that are touching on these hard topics, and particularly for populations that are more prone to these issues, particularly the LGBTQ population, and the context around how many challenges still face that population, with the context of we need to educate people who aren't in that area on the topics.
Do any of our panelists have any thoughts about that? I know it had been mentioned early on behind closed doors and the like, but how is, because obviously it's an important subject that needs to be addressed, but what's the way that you can address it in a way that's not going to create more trauma?
First, I think it's just important to think about what types of scenarios might actually benefit from having role play in a behind closed doors format versus, like, are there opportunities to have individual reflection, to talk to a partner, or a small group discussion, or to even do a case study, or thinking about other educational strategies that could come into play that ultimately still meet the same learning outcomes, but hopefully can minimize the trauma of like replaying or acting out in a role play fashion, whatever that topic is.
We have a question in the chat. And I think, we talked about this very little bit at the beginning when I asked everybody to give their own sort of personal definition of a trauma-informed practice, but we have a question about what would be a good basic first read to dig in on this topic. Again, speaking for myself, I know when it first came up, and I did what 98% of us all do, I went and Googled it, and read a number of articles about how it sort of, a lot of its roots come in the treatment of veterans, particularly in the late 60s, early 70s, post-Vietnam War, and the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. But does anybody have any go-tos as a foundational research reading book to take a look at?
One book that comes to mind for me is, it's more of a workbook. So it has a lot of different activities in it that are focused on personal, like, self-reflection, but it's called Fumbling Towards Repair. and it has a specific focus on sexual violence as a form of trauma, but covers a pretty wide spectrum otherwise, and provides some really awesome definitions and breaks down like 10 core components of a trauma-informed practice. So that could be a good place to start, fumbling towards repair.
And I think Tiffany had to step away, but I think, she had mentioned earlier that she thought at the University at Buffalo might have a trauma-informed practice area of study. Does anybody know about any other studies that might be going on in this area that people could support? Again, that was another question that popped up. Oh, okay. So again, that's something that I think we should can certainly dig into, and it's something that again, I think as this topic continues to grow, I know it's something that I want to be trying to do more research on and can share that information back out. Got another question here in the chat. From the question says, what advice would you have for a third-party campus advocate who are not necessarily employed by the university but are struggling to show the importance of advocacy to hesitant universities? So again, I think we talked about the idea of how do you serve as the advocate for this approach and the proverbial managing up?
I can jump in. Might be a little difficult if you're not part of the university, but if you have any way to get your hands on the numbers, if that's a friend in the conduct office or whatever that might look like, of what kinds of reports, and get the data of how often, how frequent those reports are being submitted, and then like the tagline. So different reports will be reported as different, levels of criticalness or things of that nature. If you can get your hands on any of that kind of data, that's going to be huge. We use that to implement how much time we spend on different kinds of training, depending on how much we're actually seeing that happen on our campus, because we'll see that we spend so much time on one thing, and then you look at it and you're like, okay, for 7,000 students on campus, we only had 3 reports of this. So does it matter? Of course. Should we still talk about it? Of course. But do we need to devote half our day to this? Probably not, when in reality, maybe we're spending a really minuscule amount of time on something that happens more frequently. So I would say if you can get your hands on any sort of the numbers for that specific campus, that would be huge in starting with where they maybe need to align their priorities.
Similarly, I think assessment is really powerful. So getting information or data, as Katie was mentioning, directly from the student at the institution that you're serving can be particularly helpful. To even have like direct quoted qualitative data about students that are receiving the services, or doing like a needs focused assessment to get information about what students are saying that are some common issues that they're experiencing, and what they propose as solutions could be helpful as well.
Finding some student groups on campus that are passionate and interested in that topic as well. I think sometimes student voices speak more loudly even than administrators. And so if you can get a group of students that are willing to partner with you, I think you can make some movement fairly quickly.
Thank you so much for that. We're getting near the end of our time. And this is normally where someone would say, let's just go around and get one last statement from everybody, but they always end up being the same statement. But what I would like to hear from each of our panelists, if it's something that you can share, if you could share a quick success story about how trauma-informed practices has made a difference in a group of students situation, that really sort of, again, if someone was coming to you and say, why should we approach this? What is the success story that you might point to in that regard? And I'm going to just, looking the way the people are lined up in the squares, Katie, we'll start with you.
Sure. I had a student that was in my office my first year at the University of Cincinnati, probably once or twice a week. And they wouldn't make eye contact. They would not, if they were going to speak, it was like one word answers, but they'd voluntarily walk through the door. They'd come in and I was the office they'd come to, but they wouldn't share why, and they wouldn't give me any sort of connection. And so I quickly learned that sports was the way that this student opened up. For whatever reason, that was the topic that got them to be engaging about whatever it was that was going on. And so long lasting relationship with this student, got them connected to a bunch of different resources, and just really small things of, hey, like, are you okay if the door stays open? And are you okay if do you want to walk around today instead of me in my office and sit the whole time? Small little changes like that started to clue me in on like what got this student to open up and what made them feel safer. All of those things led to, they're now a fourth year student. They will graduate next year. And they had gone on 3 different semesters in the 4 years that I've known them so far of being on our care roster, potentially not returning. So the fact that we're applying for graduation right now is huge. And I might not fully ever know, and I don't need to know some of the reasons of why it, those things play out the way they did his first year, but about to graduate. So it's super exciting.
And if you could go next.
Yeah, I think we all have the student success stories, and those are really heartwarming, and particularly in sometimes case management work where if the student's meeting with you, there's a problem. But I think more so the policy and how open high-level administrators are to rethinking policy in the context of COVID and in the context of just escalating student need on a variety of different areas. I think one of our biggest wins was supporting a particular student population, international students who are not eligible for any type of federal student aid, and creating an exceptional exception is what it came to be known as, that we can support these students and we advocate on their behalf. So it's not an international student having to go from office to office to office and be told no, 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 no. We now have a process internalized to make sure that they do not lose their housing based on availability or ability to pay, because frankly, people lost jobs and money all over the world. It was not just in the United States. And so not treating them as full-fledged members of this institution who contribute just as much as their domestic peers and are not just sources of money. And I think that was a big win in that we knew that as trauma-informed, empathetic professionals, but seeing it reflected in a policy.
And Leota.
Instead of sharing our story, I just have a quick quote that I thought I would share from the book that I mentioned before, Fumbling Towards Repair. And it's just a reminder that the work that we're doing is important and inspiring change across the nation. So the quote is, in order to build a movement capable of transforming our work, we have to do our best to live with one foot in the world we have not created.
That's fantastic. Amanda, your thoughts?
Sure. I had a student a few years ago who came with a lot of trauma and burdens on her, and having the flexibility at my fingertips to be able to fill in the gap to make sure that she had housing over break periods and she had housing at no additional financial cost, having the opportunity to pull in some meal swipes at no cost to her to make sure that there was food so that she could really focus on being successful academically and not have to worry about where she's going to sleep, what she's going to eat, and those basic needs. And then building that relationship. She's now graduated. She's worked for the Department of Children's and Family Services, helping other children through difficult situations, and then moved on from there and is teaching K through 12 education. And I don't know that she would have finished if we didn't have the flexibility in adjusting some of those policies.
And Tiffany, we are wrapping up with just a quick story example that illustrates why trauma-informed approaches are so important from our experiences. And you will be our last speaker.
Sorry, everyone. In residence life, as you know, we had a fire alarm go off, so we had to evacuate. I did drop a link in the chat for a website that I use when I have conversations around trauma-informed care, as it comes from the more like hospital side of life, social work, that kind of thing. But I will say over the time that I've been in housing, I had a student who was facing eviction through her apartment complex, student apartment complex. And I was able to like work with our dean of students and get all these, resources. And she's now about to graduate with her master's in rehabilitation studies. She actually texted me this morning, which was really random that I'm talking about this, and we like reached out and connected again today. But I will say too that I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the fact that sometimes we do everything that we can and we still fall short. So for the staff who are here and other, constituents, like try not to internalize that because it's not necessarily your fault. Like you did everything you can, and sometimes folks just fall through the cracks, and that's just where we are sometimes in the work that we do. So I wanted to at least recognize that although in the field of higher ed, we do as much as we can to help support as many students as we can. Sometimes students are just beyond the realm and capability of what we have the resources to support, and being okay with saying, like I had a student today who was in crisis, and we're gonna essentially have to move forward with terminating her housing contract and sending her home because just with her financial constraints, her mental health challenges, like our university just does not have all the resources that she needs to be able to support the student. And this one is tough for me because I've had several interactions with this student before because she's had a number of incidents where she's had to be transported and all the kind of stuff that is around there. But it just really has gotten to a point that our university can't support her, and I'm struggling with that now, like in real time, because I just feel like there's something else that I want to do, but there's literally nothing else. Like we've exhausted all options. So don't internalize that some of the times when you try to help folks and you are kind of at the end of the rope.
Well, thank you all so much. That brings us to our time. I think this is something that we could go on and on about. Thank you to everybody who posted links in the chat to other resources. I encourage people to take a look at that and save those for future reference. And again, as I started off by saying, I learned so much from our members and professionals that share this sort of information. And it's just incredibly heartwarming to hear these stories. And I think if there's a way to wrap up 2021, it's not 2020 anymore, but if there's a way to wrap up these last couple years, I think a podcast or a webinar here talking about the important work that is done to try and make things as good as possible for the students. I think that's about as good a way you can wrap things up as you can. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. Please go to the Talking Stick website and find those articles if you haven't read them before. And with that, I will say thank you all for your time, and we will see you in 2022.